Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 36,983 people from 160 countries and is supported by 517 organisations. We have many volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent, engaged in defending women's rights. You can become a member of WDI to help our work by volunteering or donating, or just volunteer or donate. Do join us. Today, we are going to hear from Jenny Poyer, and she's going to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria and its discontents. We're then going to hear from Caitlin Collins, the language that lies, weaponizing words. And then we're going to hear from Michelle Martin from the USA. Why is Deep Green Resistance an organizational signatory to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights? And then finally, we are going to watch a talk by Maria Binetti from Argentina, which she gave yesterday at the book launch of the WDI book, Women's Rights, Gender Wrongs, which is incredibly concerning what's happening in Argentina. So we're going to start off with Jenny Poyer. Jenny is unironically a mum with an Etsy shop. While always politically engaged, has been and active, she has a degree in political science, and that's what she's into. She would never have made this much noise if she hadn't been backed into a corner by the shockingly effective online recruiting of her daughter by the TRAs. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us, Jenny, and over to you.
I think the best way into explaining, how I got here is to just read from the beginning of the chapter that I wrote for that book called Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria and Its Discontents. So I'll start there. Imagine you've just hung a painting on your living room wall. You step back to take a look and realize it should be a few inches to the left. Just then, a neighbor pops in and tells you how to solve the problem. You must hire a builder to move the chimney, the door, and the windows a few inches to the right. Seeing your look of doubt, she calls other neighbors to weigh in. Enter the doctor, teacher, and therapist from down the street, each more emphatic than the last. Yes, rebuilding your house is the only way to center the painting. True, there will be a lengthy, costly period of mess and discomfort. The doorbell will never work again, and you might have to come and go through a window. These are but small concessions to the feeling of spatial congruence that awaits you. Should this happen to you, it will be perfectly clear that the neighbors, not you, have lost their minds. But this clarity will not resolve the isolation or the bewilderment you will experience in the aftermath. So I'll leave off there from the book. The chapter goes on to describe rapid onset gender dysphoria, what it is, and to give the reader an idea of how it impacts the family. I'm not a campaigner or what we call activist in the US by temperament. I haven't done a lot of marching, and when I have marched, I've never been the one carrying the big sign, much less making the speech. But I'm grateful for those who do carry the big sign and make the speech. But I never imagined that I would even do as much, speaking out about an issue that's controversial as I've done about this one. But it's so extraordinarily unique in so many ways that when it became an issue in my personal life and my family, it took me a few years really to kind of get my head around what we were really exploring here, which was a child at 13 saying that she was, now identifying as a member of the opposite sex. And this was before it was happening, in every other street, on every other block. And it really struck me as kind of the first time a young girl had ever come out as transgender, because I had only ever heard about the phenomenon, through the stories that I would hear on National Public Radio, which were pretty much always about trans women of color who, were disproportionately the victims of violence and bigotry in the culture. And, it seemed to me that this was a niche, type of predicament that one finds himself in. And it just didn't seem possible that it would ever really become like an active part of my everyday thoughts. But it became a very, all-encompassing interrogation that I kind of immersed myself in for about 5 years before I finally felt I actually really understand this thing, and I think I can start to explain it to people. And I started writing, only to find out that there was no appetite for, for my version of this story. And there was just a big hole in the media in the US where the routine reporting on an issue like this should have been. So it took a couple more years before I finally came across WDI and had the opportunity to submit the chapter for this book, which I was thrilled to have accepted. And then once that happened, I began to find other outlets to publish my writing. But that hole in the information ecosystem is still very large, and it's very hard to break through and to figure out why it has to be that way in this country.
You became interested in this topic when your daughter told you she was a boy. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about it. It was 7 years ago, 2016, and she was 13, so she's 20 now. And as I said before, I hadn't heard of this happening to anyone else I knew. And my whole idea of what it meant to be transgender was really confined to those stories on NPR about trans women of color, and then a documentary that I'd seen years earlier about a couple of little kids who were identifying as transgender. And that was those were done I think shortly after the Boston clinic opened in the United States, which was the first clinic that to offer so-called affirmative care to children in the United States. And in the period since then, between 2007 and today, there's now, I've heard estimates from 100 to 400, and it's crazy that I can't even tell you what that number is, but that's kind of a good example of the information vacuum that we deal with here, without an NHS and with a very, localized and profit-centered healthcare system, with this, this sort of new treatment category added on to the healthcare system that we have. It doesn't exactly fit into a medical model, or at least it does when, it fits into a medical model when doctors want to have their work covered, reimbursed by insurance companies. But it's quite separate from a medical model when activists want to persuade us that, that there's nothing pathological about being transgender, and that there's, it's not a problem in any way. It's not, except when it requires insurance coverage.
Yeah. And what did you seek or get any professional support or lack of support? What happened once you started engaging? And
the first kind of shock to my system was to realize that the structure, the school system, the faculty, the counselors, the teachers, support people had all somehow been trained, seemingly thoroughly trained in this aspect of, potential child need or presentation, that, I'd never heard of this. I'd never known any of this training was happening in school. And I'd been pretty active as a parent volunteer. I'd been active in PTA legislative advocacy. It just seems like something I would have known if it had been the intention of the school district to include parents in this, in this understanding this new phenomenon that they were all getting in gear to apply, to children who might present with this unique problem. So I was informed that the only way they could react, and the only way it would be appropriate for me and my husband to react to this announcement, was to be affirmative, which meant to agree that our daughter was a boy, and to use her pronouns, and that the school would.
And this was 7 years ago. 7 years
Yes.
ago. Wow. Already. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't presented to us as, it, I would say the approach from the school was as kind of warm and conciliatory as you can imagine, which made it, and these were people I knew pretty well, and respected and trusted. And so it was just really kind of destabilizing to hear information from them that sounded so authoritative, but made so little objective sense. So I sought the help of a behavioral child psychiatrist who I had kind of known in a social context. And, he is an older man, had been practicing for 30 years. This was the first, patient that he came across who had this transgender presentation. But it turned out, 3 years later, he had 3 or 4 more. But he did have sort of he had a more of a reasonable approach to it, but he did say that this is how, the entire profession is treating this presentation. This is what you can expect if you go to almost any therapist. And if you go to a gender clinic, they are very likely to tell you that there's only one course of treatment for this child. And, and it's not going to be, let's try to talk some sense into her and, and just tell her the truth, and, get her interested in tennis or something, So luckily I never had any urge or, temptation to take her to the gender clinic, which would have been pretty close by at UC San Francisco, which is kind of the mothership on the West Coast of, together with UCLA, of sort of the craziest and most extreme applications of youth gender medicine.
And you managed to have a good relationship with your daughter all the way through this, which is quite an achievement. Or were there any moments when it was tricky?
There were Yeah, there were moments. I mean, it would be fair to say there were months or even years where, it was very difficult to communicate about this. We are in a good place now. She's 20. She hasn't, done any permanent harm to her body. She's not completely, separating herself from the ideology, but I do feel fairly confident that she's on the path to, um, maybe putting this in perspective and moving on.
One thing that I was going to ask you is about the WPATH guidelines, that you know about those, and what can you tell us about those WPATH, and can you tell us what WPATH is? What are those guidelines, and what do you think of them?
Yeah. WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health or Healthcare, WPATH. And I actually wrote a long article on my Substack about WPATH, and in the process, I learned things that I didn't know before. It's an organization that got its start in the middle of the last century, as the Harry Benjamin. There's a long name, but the Harry Benjamin Institute for Transgender Healthcare. Harry Benjamin was an endocrinologist whose first famous patient was Christine Jorgensen, who in the U.S. is known as the first transgender woman to come out and get a lot of notoriety for that. And then Harry Benjamin proceeded to transition a number of other middle-aged men, and for a very long time, it was a very niche, very small cohort of people who had any interest in appearing as the other sex, and they were all at least grown, if not middle-aged men. Around the turn of the 21st century, WPATH, or the Harry Benjamin Institute, morphed into WPATH and became renamed as WPATH in the early 2000s. And it gradually, during that time, shifted from being a medical society with practitioners who had this niche interest in, helping a small number of, again, mostly men, successfully transition their appearance to that of a woman. They were beginning to offer a different protocol to children based on what's called the Dutch studies, based on some experiments that had been done around 1998 to early 2000s on an initial cohort of children 17 and under who were referred to the Amsterdam clinic to undergo a very specific protocol involving puberty blockers for the youngest ones, followed by cross-sex hormones, and then followed at 18 by surgeries, including genital surgeries. So the Dutch studies were promoted as as evidence that children could be transitioned to the opposite sex, and that the advantage of doing this is that the problems encountered by adult transsexuals having to do with society not accepting them as being the women that they wanted to present as, that the reasons that the society couldn't accept their transitions is because they didn't really look like women, and that the way to solve that problem would be to begin to change bodies from the inside out with hormones by blocking puberty of patients young enough to prevent their ever developing secondary sexual characteristics. So Adam's apples, breasts, wider jaws, and all the things that we associate with identifiable sex markers. So they got this cohort, the Dutch in Amsterdam, they got this cohort of 70 child volunteers to go through the whole protocol, and they had to conform to certain requirements, like no other comorbidities. So these couldn't be kids who had anxiety or depression or learning disabilities or any other kind of contributing factors to their distress. It had to be children who were just simply distressed about feeling that they were born in the wrong body from as early an age as they were capable of communicating that. And then they had to have parents who were fully supportive of the idea of their presenting as the opposite sex. So this was the cohort of children that the Dutch did their experiments on. And the results were catastrophic by almost any measure. They actually killed one of these patients in the process of surgically, removing his genitals. He died from an infection directly from that surgery. A number of other patients developed diabetes as a result of their cross-sex hormones, which made them obese to the point that they were diagnosed with diabetic conditions that made it impossible for them to continue with the protocol and the surgeries. So they were out. And then a large number, I think it was like 15 of the 70, just simply were lost to follow-up, and this is in a matter of a couple of years. So kids, in other words, were so, like, I don't know if they were traumatized or harmed or in what way they were so disinclined to continue with the protocol that they wouldn't even talk to the clinicians who wanted to understand what had happened to them, just so that they could complete the research. Okay, so 70 kids, 55 made it to the next to the first marker, where the first study was conducted to analyze how the patients were doing in the process of going from entering the study, starting on the puberty blockers, and then proceeding to cross-sex hormones. So 15 were lost to follow-up or otherwise disabled by the process. So the initial study reported that, notwithstanding the ones that we can't tell you about because they're just gone, but the rest of them seem to be doing great. And that was based on, basically a customer satisfaction survey where they asked the kids if they were feeling more like the desired sex, and the kids said yes, they were. And so everything was going great. So then they get to the next place where now they're doing surgeries on these kids. One of them dies, and another number fall off the program for the reasons I've just described, and now 32 are left at the end who can be said to have completed the protocol. So they go from 70 to 32, and then they take these 32 survivors and they ask them how everything's going for them, and lo and behold, it's going great. So only recently has it been reported that the evidence that those 32 patients were doing well came from surveys that had literally been switched, so that at the beginning of the survey, if you were a young boy who entered the protocol, you would have been asked a series of questions that you were supposed to answer on a scale of 1 to 10. How strongly you felt about this issue. So you would have been asked, to rate the statement, I hate getting erections because they remind me that I'm a boy. And then you would have had to, give that a number. Well, after it was all said and done, now the Dutch researchers have declared that you are now a woman. And so they give you the questionnaire that was written for the young girls who entered the study, and you were now asked to respond to the question, I hate menstruating because it reminds me that I'm a girl. So in other words, like even the survey, tool that they used to measure whether the remaining patients who had survived and were, lived to tell the tale and still even wanted to, was a survey that couldn't possibly deliver the information they even said they were seeking. So it was, I'm not a scientist or a researcher, of any kind. I'm just reading this and thinking, how does this study even, how do these people, how does the clinic stay open, after doing this kind of research? But not only do they stay open, but, the reports from this Dutch protocol actually became the basis. It is called the gold standard by WPATH, which now is the activist organization that makes all of the decisions about standards of care for trans identifying patients of any age, anywhere in the world. And essentially, those guidelines, I know you asked about WPATH, and I kind of went on a tangent.
Yeah.
But, as far as the quote unquote gender affirming care of children in, at least in the United States, is concerned, the WPATH standards of care that are the most recent, number 8, they call it SOC 8, now recommend that there be no requirements for a child patient to be any particular age to undergo surgeries, what they call top surgery, which is cosmetic double mastectomy, or genital surgeries. So progressively, as these standards have been revised every few years, the requirements have just gotten more and more, open.
Yeah, it's
less and less restrictive. Sorry, go ahead.
It's getting worse. I mean, it seems to be getting worse and worse, and only the professions are who are still going along with this. It's really, really appalling. Well, Jenny, what do you think should happen now? And is there anything that women watching could do, or what would you suggest that women do now?
We need to be talking about this. I think we need to be, in the US, we need to be asking our elected leaders, specific questions about their assessment of the situation, and whether they think, whether they even have any idea of what's really happening, whether they feel that they have a role in establishing regulations, or even just like, bringing the conversation out into the open. It's very polarized in the US. It's become very much a subject that if you belong to my party, if you're a liberal voter and you're a Democrat, you're supposed to believe the opposite of what I believe. So again, it's a destabilizing, place to be, and it's a difficult conversation to have, even with just social acquaintances, and it's just it's like a third rail. However, we got to start talking about it, because nothing changes until people become aware of what's really happening, and the fact that medical experiments on children that are harming them and sterilizing them are not a political issue.
So we're now going to go to Caitlin Collins. And Caitlin is a writer, an editor, and a supporter of women's rights. And she has signed the Declaration on Women's Sexist Rights and is coming on to talk a bit about that, but also to talk about the title of Caitlin's talk is The Language That Lies, Weaponising Words.
I signed because I'm furious about what's happening, that half the human race is under attack by the deluded zealots of the so-called trans rights movement. But actually, it's worse than that. It's much worse than that. Our children are under attack. And I mean, as Jenny reminded us all, I mean, this is just horrific. And what's really incredible to me is that so many people are going along with something that is so obviously wrong. I mean, that's just staggering. So that's a question that I have and that I like to ask people. Why are people going along with an ideology that's so obviously deluded and dangerous? And, you know, we can have conversations and very interesting ones about internalized misogyny and patriarchal conditioning and all of this. And yes, it's interesting and relevant. But what I wanted to talk about this afternoon is something else. As a writer and editor, I'm really interested in language. And I'm interested in how language affects how we think and how our thought affects how we perceive reality. And I can see more and more how language is playing a really big part in this extraordinary rise of the trans demands movement, as I prefer to call it. We need to be able to say what we mean. And the thing is that not only are supporters of the trans demands movement trying to silence us by threatening and punishing those who speak out, but more than that, they're weaponizing words. They're changing the meaning of the words that we use, so they no longer mean what we want them to mean. And I believe that there is a deliberate strategy of distorting language in order to confuse and deceive people, along with promoting lies. And if you repeat lies often enough, those lies can worm their way into people's minds to change people's views about reality. So I pulled out some examples for this afternoon, and these are just a few very simple examples, and I'm sure everybody here will think of many more examples. But let's just start with the phrase trans rights. It sounds great, doesn't it? It sounds absolutely fine. You know, a marginalized group of people asking others to respect their rights. But when you think about it, what are trans rights? Trans people are already protected by the same rights that protect us all. Trans rights are really men's demands. They're not even men's rights. You sometimes hear people saying the trans rights movement is a men's rights movement. It isn't, because trans rights are not rights at all. They're men's demands. And they're mainly demands that men should be allowed to usurp or kind of invade women's rights and enter protected spaces set aside for women. So the so-called trans rights movement, I'm more and more moving away from calling it that. I'm calling it a men's demands movement or a trans demands movement. And then what about the claim that gets repeated again and again like a mantra, trans women are women? No, they're not. Trans women are men who wish to be identified as women. And the only way that we can say that they're women is by redefining the word woman to refer to some sort of fantasy of personal identity. So trans woman is actually a political term. Calling men women removes the distinction between the sexes. So the whole concept of women's rights is lost, along with our right to protected spaces that keep men out. And people who aren't up to speed with this kind of double speak, the sort of new speak, hear the term trans woman, and they hear the woman part of it. And they assume, quite reasonably, that it means woman, because that's what it says. They may even think it means a woman who wants to identify as a man. So if you ask members of the public if trans women should be allowed into women's spaces, they may very well say yes. But if you ask them if men pretending to be women should be allowed into women's spaces, they'll say no. So we've got public opinion being manipulated by this politically motivated, dishonest language. So again, I prefer to use the more truthful term, trans-identifying man. So everybody knows what we're talking about. Then we've got the term cis woman, which is something that really just it enrages me. So they say it means a woman whose gender identity matches her assigned sex. Well, what the hell does that mean? Cis is actually an offensive term. And again, it has political implications. This term cis is a prefix, just as trans is a prefix that is attached to the word woman. And the point of it is to give the misleading impression that there are two kinds of women, equally valid, cis and trans. I mean, this is emphatically not the case. So again, I prefer to stick to the term woman, which has been around an awful lot longer than the trans demands movement. Then we've got the claim that sex is assigned at birth, which we all know is nonsense. It isn't like sticking a sorting hat on a child's head to assign it to Gryffindor or Slytherin or something. Sex is observed at birth. We all know that. It's observed at birth or even earlier in the womb, having been set at conception. It's a biological fact. It refers to whether an individual's body is set up to produce sperm or eggs. And mammals can't change sex. Clownfish can, we're often told that, but humans aren't fish. Claiming that sex is assigned is another political ploy. It's a ploy to deceive people into believing that there could be mistakes, that sex could have been wrongly assigned, and also into believing that people can choose and change their sex because, hey, it's only a label. One or two more here. This word inclusive that's bandied about so much now, it sounds nice and friendly, doesn't it? Except it now means exclusive. A space described as inclusive, you can bet your bottom dollar, to use an American phrase, will exclude anyone who doesn't go along with the trans demands movement. Women who don't want to share their single-sex protected spaces with men will be excluded. And possibly, if you're really lucky, you'll get offered re-education. This is happening in political parties in the UK. Labour, the Lib Dems and Greens are particularly badly affected, with calls for people expressing so-called transphobic views to be expelled or re-educated. And we have in the UK the chief executive of the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, who is a man masquerading as a woman, has publicly stated that women who are bigoted, that's his word, for traumatized rape victims who don't want a bloke helping them, these bigoted women should be re-educated as part of their treatment. Another redefined word that's worth visiting is the word kind, as in just be kind. Again, it's a political thing. This slogan, just be kind, is promoted on placards by trans demand zealots at every opportunity. Except what it really means is be kind to everyone except women who speak up for their rights. But just be kind is a great slogan. And the trans demands movement were very, very quick to claim it and the moral high ground that goes with it. It's not an accident that they've taken this on, because you see just be kind and you think, oh yes, these must be the good guys. It's a political statement. And I'm nearly at the end here, but I just wanted to put in a couple of blatant lies that are often repeated. So the first one I wanted to mention is, it never happens. And this again is a deliberate lie that is being used to undermine women's insistence on our right to women-only spaces. It completely ignores the fact of male sex predators exploiting the opportunities created by the trans demands movement. But male criminals and sex predators are suddenly discovering their inner female en route to jail. So they can be diverted to a women's prison, which is a better environment and, gosh, offers a ready supply of captive prey. And I think we can all give huge thanks here to the Scottish sex offender whose real name is Adam Graham, but was calling himself Isla Bryson, who brought this scandal to the public's attention. Was it last year? It was not so long ago. He didn't mean to do us a favour, but he scored a spectacular own goal for the Trans Demands team when he alerted people to what was going on in Scotland. And he also contributed to Nicola Sturgeon's very well-deserved downfall, as she was floundering about how to define a man and a woman and a trans woman and who should be in women's prisons. And I mean, she tied herself in knots. And then the other lie I wanted to highlight follows on from this, and that's the lie that we get told, which is, you're saying that all trans women are sex predators, which depicts us as being horrible bigots. Except it's a lie, because we're not saying that. Nobody's saying that. We're saying that all trans women are men. And we aren't saying that all men are sex predators. Of course not. Of course that men are not sex predators. It's rubbish. But women's protected spaces were set up all over the world to exclude all men, because a sign on the door saying nice men can come in, but sex predators, please keep out, isn't going to work. I've left pronouns for last. Pronouns is something that really gets me going. Anyone who attends group meetings on Zoom or in real life will sooner or later be required to share pronouns. And for those of us who are more self-controlled than I am and can resist the temptation to go off pop, we can seize this as an opportunity. The pronoun game is an exercise in virtue signaling. It signals support for the trans demands movement. Using dishonest pronouns tricks people into going along with the lie that a man is a woman if he says so. Horrifyingly, it's enabling the reporting of crimes committed by men as though they have been committed by women. We've seen things where rapists are referred to by female pronouns, feminine pronouns. I mean, this is insane. There have been cases in the British courts where a woman has been required to say she inserted her penis. I mean, you look at that and you weep. I mean, it's appalling. So the effect on me when I see pronouns in somebody's email signature, or I'm asked to share pronouns in a group, is to feel frightened. Enraged, yes, but frightened, actually frightened, because does this person or group really, truly, sincerely support this dishonest and dangerous ideology? If they do, how could I possibly trust them? How could I possibly respect them? The thing is that people are free to make demands, and a man can demand that we can refer to him by feminine pronouns. That's fine. He has every right to make that demand. But the crucial point is that we are free to refuse. And we have to remember that. Always, always, always remember that. We are free to refuse. We cannot be compelled cannot be forced to use compelled speech. We're not obliged to play the pronoun game. And instead, if we can be sufficiently, have sufficient presence of mind, we can take the opportunity to explain what it's really about and why we object to it. And maybe, just maybe, I live in hope that we might alert some people to the sinister agenda of trans demands movement. So I'll stop here. I promised Joe I wouldn't go over 10 minutes. So these are just a few examples of the corruption of language by the trans demands movement. I'm sure everyone listening today can think of lots more. This is a war on women, and it's a war on children. And the weaponizing of words is a deliberate strategy to deceive people and to get them to go along with a deluded and destructive ideology. And I believe that one of the most important ways that we can all, every one of us, can fight back is by pointing out lies when we come across them and insisting on accuracy and honesty at every opportunity. And we can all do that.
what sort of books do you write because you're a writer, or if they are books, what do you write about?
Yeah, I'm actually retired now, but I've written several novels and several non-fiction books, one on horses and riding, and one on stopping smoking. And I do edit I'm still doing some editing of novels for other people, but I did spend, it must have been 12 years or more, writing educational materials for school children. And the particular educational materials they were I was writing for a lovely man who was very keen on psychological and emotional self-help for children. And so I was writing the scripts that he was then using for audio downloads for children to listen to. And they were under various topics, and so the children could choose a topic, and then they would listen to this man who had a wonderful speaking voice, just reading through one of my scripts that would then give the children tools to help themselves. And the beauty of it was that they didn't have to go to the school counsellor, nobody need to know that they were doing it. And it kind of, a horrible overused word, but it kind of empowered them to look at things differently and then to take do different things. And so I was quite switched on to the importance of how to use words and language, and how words and language can influence thought, and then how we see our world, and how extremely important it is to be honest and accurate. And unfortunately, his program kind of stopped before this trans nonsense came up, because I would have absolutely loved writing some scripts about this, because I'm passionate about it, but he's no longer operating. So I have to do my campaigning more kind of, I don't have the same platform as I used to have.
So our next speaker is Michelle Martin. She joined Deep Green Resistance in 2017, has been Women's Caucus Chair of the organisation since 2019. She lives with her son between the mountains and ocean on unceded land of the Dena'ina people in Anchorage, Alaska. And it is incredibly good of her to have got up and been here for at least an hour waiting to speak, because it's incredibly early there in Alaska. Michelle's going to talk about why is Deep Green Resistance an organisational signatory to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So thank you so much for coming, Michelle. Over to you.
So Deep Green Resistance is an international organization of above ground activists who are biophilic, meaning lovers of life, lovers of all the diverse life around us, below us, above us, within our own bodies, without whom we would cease to exist. All the beings, the mountains and rivers and oceans, salmon and moose and raven and bears and spruce trees and fireweed and mosses and mushrooms. I'll ask you to fill in the beings that live where you live, that you know, that you love, and that you live with, that you know are a part of the life of the land that supports your life and the life of your family. We know that humans are one species in a web of life that is rapidly being shredded apart by the forces of the global industrial economy. There are, of course, ongoing public conversations about what to do about this problem of, for instance, runaway global warming that we know is caused both by the burning of fossil fuel and also by the destruction of the very lands and waters whose bodies are torn asunder so that the carbon that they once held is now in our atmosphere. The scalping of Earth's body and the poisoning of her oceans. There are conversations going on about what are we going to do about this. Unfortunately, though, the conversations tend to center on either consumer choices, like if I use the right light bulbs, or if I take a cloth bag to the grocery store, or if I reduce the amount of fossil fuel that I'm using in my home. That those consumer choices might be the answer. Or another focus might be on techno fixes, on any number of different ideas that if we come upon the right technology, that we can both keep this industrial way of life and a living planet. These conversations that tend to dominate in this realm tie in for me with what Caitlin was just talking about in terms of lies that are repeated over and over again, changing our perception of reality, of what our actual options are, and of what reality we really live in. Those of us who are members of deep green resistance have come to an understanding that techno fixes will not save us. Even so-called green energy, wind and solar, things like this are all things that rely upon the extractive economy, and that really ultimately are not going to change things or to stop the destruction. It's understandable, of course, to want to believe that the only way of life you've ever known, that your family has ever known, that your loved ones have ever known can be saved. It's understandable. That if we only make the right choices ourselves, that we'll be okay. Those of us in this organization really want to come together and have actual adult conversations about this, and get out of the lies of some of the dominant narratives. We're also aware that we don't live in a system of power out of which the powerful can be educated. And those are, might not be a direct quote, but those are words that I take from Leah Keith, who's one of our organization's founders, and who many of you also know, because she's been on these webinars very frequently. And so we know that the wholesale destruction of the lands and waters of Mama Earth's body, the genocide of every matriarchal human culture, these acts are not due to misunderstanding. They are this system working exactly as it's supposed to work. So given the gravity of the situation in which we find ourselves, those of us who are part of this organization known as Deep Green Resistance come together to say no to this culture of destruction. Our strategy includes an understanding that given the gravity of where we are at, acts of underground sabotage to physically dismantle those systems that are causing the physical destruction of Earth are necessary. That said, those who join Deep Green Resistance agree that we are above ground activists. We will not engage in underground work or any illegal acts beyond acts of civil disobedience. But we do affirm the need for such action and hope that there are underground actors out there that are being smart. And we say, don't talk to us who are above ground activists saying these things out loud, and don't, if you're thinking of being an underground activist, say these things out loud. For your safety, for our safety, there needs to be a firewall between any above ground group and any below ground group so that we don't know each other, but we can still affirm the same needs. So that's some of who we are, of what things we say that the most environmental organizations maybe don't say. We know from successful examples of struggles for resistance, like for instance, the fight for Irish independence or the work of the African National Congress in South Africa, that even a very small percentage of the population engaged in meaningful underground work can be effective. And that's especially true if there is an above ground culture of resistance supporting those sorts of actions. The Deep Green Resistance book, it's a book called Deep Green Resistance Strategy to Save the Planet, and it's written by Eric McBay, Leah Keith, and Derek Jensen. It's full of more specifics on strategy for both underground and above ground activists, including things like security culture, which I know there've been webinars here on WDI's webinars specifically about security culture, about the absolute necessity of a firewall between underground and above ground groups. So there's more on all of that if folks are interested in any of that. But as above ground activists, those of us who are in Deep Green Resistance really have a task of building a culture of resistance, a culture that affirms the sanctity of life, affirms our absolute love for Mama Earth, for all of the beings around us that I spoke about at the beginning. And also recognizing that such a culture must say a resounding no to the wholesale destruction of Earth's body that we're witness to, and also must say no to all systems of subjugation of humans by other humans. And this is where the work of Deep Green Resistance and the work of WDI most clearly overlap in saying no to cultural or political practices that undermine the ability of all members of society to fully engage in that society. And we stand in solidarity with WDI and others who are doing the work that many of you here on this call are doing. I will briefly read out, Deep Green Resistance has 5 guiding principles. Number 1 is the soil, the air, the water, the climate, and the food we eat are created by complex communities of living creatures. The needs of those living communities are primary. Individual and social morality must emerge from a humble relationship with the web of life. Number 2, civilization, especially industrial civilization. And when we say civilization, we're meaning human populations that are dense enough to live in cities and to require the importation of things that will be extracted from other lands. So civilization, especially industrial civilization, is fundamentally destructive to life on Earth. Our task is to create a life-centered resistance movement that will dismantle industrial civilization by any means necessary. Organized political resistance is the only hope for our planet. 3, Deep Green Resistance works to end abuse at the personal, organizational, and cultural levels. We also strive to eradicate domination and subordination from our private lives and sexual practices. Deep Green Resistance aligns itself with feminists and others who seek to eradicate all social domination and to promote solidarity between oppressed peoples. Number 4, when civilization ends, the living world will rejoice. We must be biophilic people in order to survive. Those of us who have forgotten how must learn again to live with the land and air and water and creatures around us in communities built on respect and thanksgiving. We welcome this future. And number 5, Deep Green Resistance is a radical feminist organization. Men as a class are waging a war against women. Rape, battering, incest, prostitution, pornography, poverty, and gynocide are both the main weapons in this war and the conditions that create the sex class women. Gender is not natural, not a choice, and not a feeling. It is the structure of women's oppression. Attempts to create more choices within the sex caste system only serve to reinforce the brutal realities of male power. As radicals, we intend to dismantle gender and the entire system of patriarchy which it embodies. The freedom of women as a class cannot be separated from the resistance to the dominant culture as a whole. So those are our 5 guiding principles as an organization. And as you can see, the last one, number 5, very much overlaps with the work of WDI. As above ground activists, Deep Green Resistance members are engaged in a wide variety of work ranging from land defense campaigns to feminist activism, to building permaculture systems that can sustain life without industrial inputs, to working on building just and sustainable human societies. I will end by saying that my most fervent prayer always is for each of my sisters, that their gifts flow from them with ease and with joy to bless their lands and their people. And I wish that for each of you, and I and all of the members of Deep Green Resistance are deeply grateful to WDI as an organization, to the individuals that do the work that you're doing, and to all of you women out there who are doing the work that you're doing. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. We stand in solidarity with you, and we give you great thanks for your good work.
We're going to now watch a video that was recorded yesterday. It was from Maria Binetti, WDI, the Women's Declaration International country contact for Argentina. She was speaking at the book launch of Women's Rights, Gender Wrongs, which is the WDI book that's just been published.
I wrote 2 articles, one with Lara Salvatierra from Peru concerning surrogacy in South America, and the second one, which is what I'm going to talk about, is focus on Argentina. The title of the article is Gender Equality for All Genders in Plural, multiple genders, the Argentinian face program for the certifying sex. Gender equality applied to all genders means something like, I don't know exactly what that means, but something like the right to perform any kind of self-perception. That would be the idea, to the right to perform freely any kind of self-perception. I took the expression of a face program for the certifying sex. That is not my expression. I took that from a final report written by the group of scholars from the King London College in London. The King College in London last year. The report explained the steps to operate a gradual desertification of sex. That means the strategies of manipulation for the desertification of sex, globally speaking. So Argentina is one of the best examples of what is happening in South America, is the desertification of sex. South America is the most unequal, corrupt, and violent continent for women in the world. Half of South American women are poor. Countries like Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina are completely captured by this lobby. Let us remember that Ecuador and Bolivia were the first countries to implement gender identity in their constitutions, followed by Argentina and Brazil with gender identity laws. Argentina was the first country to allow a legal change of sex by self-declaration at any age. We have kids of 4 or 5 years old with the new ID. But the interesting chapter in Argentina is that since 2019, we have a ministry for all genders in plural that includes all gender identities of pregnant people and penis ejaculating people. This ministry has an annual budget of 3.4% of the gross domestic product to implement the genders agenda in every area of the state. This agenda is operated through administrative and executive orders, plans, programs, provisions, without any debate or consultation. And these orders are directly executed or implemented by the president, ministries, secretaries, but without any debate from the people. That was the case, for example, with the creation of a new legal sex in 2021 by an executive order. It was the president of the country who decided that there should be a new sex, the non-binary or indeterminate or in a specified sex. The question would be who advised the president or who maybe sponsored the president. But the implementation is top-down, not directly top-down with this kind of provisions, program orders. The implantation of the genders implies a strong language control. The first step in this language control is to replace gender as a category by genders in plural, as if genders in plural were the inclusive and more progressive meaning of gender. In that vein, the Ministry of Genders has set a large number of programs, plans, reforms, resolutions for all genders in plural, in all areas, level, and platform of the state. So the single-sex provision and the positive measures relating to the female sex now are democratized for everyone, for all genders. Another fundamental step of this language control is to erase the mark of sexual difference from the language, neutralizing the language with expressions such as the letters E or X, or menstruating pregnant breastfeed person. These are strategies of manipulation to control the language. Our Ministry of Genders has created a guide to the correct use of this slang under the title of Renaming Guide. This is a national guide, a guide for a correct use of this language. This guide is implemented by official institutions such as ministries, secretaries, universities, schools. And the guide also introduces new definitions and standards, not only a way of speaking or communicating, but new redefinitions, for example, of woman. Woman, redefined by this guide, means a person whose gender identity and gender expression are feminine. That is woman, according to the new guide. These new standards explain that we have genders in a step of gender in all new bill projects planned. We have genders instead of the category of genders, but also we have to reformulate with genders now the all laws, plans, resolutions, etc. For example, the law for the protection of women against violence now is not for women, now is for all genders. So we have to reformulate any law, any program, any initiative, any order. We have to reformulate that according to the whole staff of genders. The same goes for the annual National Women Encounter, that now is the Plurinational Diversities Encounter. The same goes for the mandatory sex education in schools, now is a queer indoctrination and propaganda. The same for the whole mass media and public university are ideological apparatus of this lobby. Sexual work is normalized.
Can you just hang on a minute? We can't hear you. It's frozen. Can you just wait a second, Maria?
By the state, by education conference. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. Thank you. We lost about half a minute of your speaking.
Okay, so I'm coming back. We have to formulate new laws and programs, and according to the standards of all genders, but also to reformulate the old ones. So we have to reformulate laws, programs according to genders. For example, the law, we had a very good law against women's violence, and now this law is proposed to be reformulated for all genders. The annual National Women Encounter now is the Plurinational Diversities Encounter. The mandatory sex education in a school now is queer indoctrination and propaganda. The mass media, public university are completely captured by this lobby. Sexual work is normalized and promoted from the state. And the interesting issue is that the legalization of abortion is a flag manipulated by this queer establishment to erase the category of women and facilitate reproductive exploitation in the whole South America. It already happened in Argentina, and that is a plan for the whole South American to manipulate the flag of abortion. So that is how the desertification program is going on in Argentina around now. However, now the country is in the middle of a complete crisis, economical and social crisis. So thanks to that crisis, the advance of queer ideology is frozen, thanks to the political nemesis such that this agenda is frozen. So we are very, very bad, but it could have been even worse. Thanks to the crisis, this picture is frozen by now.